Hey everyone, in this video we're going to talk about the subject of marriage and the question of whether we can have two definitions of marriage functioning in our society simultaneously. So before I go on, you may have noticed that I have a new hat on. This is a Minnesota Twins hat that one of my viewers sent me. Thank you so much, Anthony, for sending me this hat. I am getting pretty close to completing my Major League Baseball hat collection thanks to many different viewers who have sent me hats, and it's great now to have the Twins hat added to my collection. Also, if you are watching this video and you like Christian nerdy content like this, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell notifications so that you know when I upload a new video.
Knowledge.
What got me thinking about this is the recent Respect for Marriage Act. There's been a lot of discussion about marriage. Of course, there's always a lot of discussion in our culture about marriage, but even more so recently with the Respect for Marriage Act. And one of the approaches to dealing with the subject of marriage in our pluralistic culture is that espoused by David French. I heard him on a podcast recently, and I want to critique his view. His view is the approach of having two different definitions and approaches to marriage functioning at the same time in our culture. So the way he looks at this is that you have the biblical view of marriage, which he calls covenant marriage, and that's what he personally holds to. But he says simultaneously with that, you can also have a civil definition and function of marriage, which is how the society at large views and utilizes marriage. And so these are the two different definitions and functions, I guess you could say, of marriage according to David French. And I have a response to this as I was thinking about what he was saying. And my response is that it's not a good way to approach the subject for two reasons. I really do disagree with his approach, and I want to lay out two reasons why. The first is that his approach, I don't believe, on a practical level, works. I don't think his approach works well. I know that he's trying to allow Christians to have their own view, which again is what he holds to, a covenant view of marriage between a man and a woman for life. And he's saying that our society for years hasn't held to really a biblical understanding of marriage because we have things like no-fault divorce, for example, which is not really biblical. So he says we can have these two different definitions and functions of marriage in society. But I don't think that works in practice. We've seen for years how the civil definition of marriage and the erosion of a biblical view of marriage has really hurt our society. But I think a really good example of how it doesn't work very well to have these two different definitions of marriage is actually something I was reading about in an article recently by Bethel McGrew. It's called Speaking the Truth Honestly, Moral Progressives Show No Respect for Christians Who Retreat. So she's really talking in this article about the need for us to speak forthrightly about our beliefs and be careful when we try to be too accommodating. It actually leads to greater resentment toward Christians. But at the beginning of the article, I'll read that because I think it's really pertinent to what I'm talking about here. She says, when Trish Harrison Warren published her recent New York Times op-ed on gay marriage and pluralism, she probably didn't expect that her comment section would immediately fill up with angry leftists. But one day, and about 1,000 replies later, the paper had to close comments. They were just coming in too fast. What did Warren, ordained in the ACNA, say to draw such ire? Did she make a bold case against the newly passed Respect for Marriage Act? Did she, like Katie Faust, cite unsettling statistics about gay parenting and its long-term impact on children? Did she condemn the economic pipeline that allows two men to disappear the women involved in creating and carrying their perfect designer baby? Of course, she did none of these things. In fact, she speaks warmly and non-judgmentally about her gay married friend and his husband. Her thesis is that Christians can still respect gay marriage as a civil right, even if they can't participate enthusiastically in the ritual. That sounds a lot like what David French was expressing. All she asks is that Christians and their private religious convictions be respected in return. If they don't want to bake a cake or design a website, she thinks they shouldn't be forced to. She ends by predicting most people on both sides would agree with her. How did that go? The comments on her column have been intense, to say the least. She expected wide agreement, but she's been called a hypocrite and a bigot. So what I think this really shows graphically is that David French's approach, while in theory it sounds good to have these two different definitions functioning at the same time, on a practical level, in the real world, it doesn't work out well. And you can see why, because if we're using the same word for two different things, it's going to cause frustration and dissension. Imagine someone says to me that I'm a married person, and they say that this is their gay partner who they're married to. And I say, well, okay, you're married in one definition, but you're not married according to my definition. That's not going to fly very well. If we try to say, or if they look at us and they say, well, we'll only marry certain people in our church because that's what we view as the biblical view of marriage. Well, we're truly married. We think we can truly be married. See, because we're using the same word, it's going to cause a lot of frustration and clashing and dissension. And I think actually, even though he's trying to solve the problem by positing this two-marriage view, it actually creates even more dissension. And I think you're seeing that play out in many ways. It just doesn't work to have two different definitions of the same word at the same time. So the first problem is that it doesn't work, but the other problem with the two-definition view of marriage is that it doesn't acknowledge the Christian view of marriage, that it is rooted in a universal moral principle. And I want to demonstrate this from the Bible, but I think this is a really important point, and it's a point that a lot of Christians have really conceded. It's almost as if they're saying, well, our view of marriage is just one of many views of marriage, whereas what I believe the Bible teaches is that the Christian view of marriage is a universal moral principle for all people. And I think the pushback to this is going to be, well, wait a second. Don't different cultures have different views of marriage historically? And the answer to that is, well, let's look at what Jesus says. Okay, let's see how Jesus looks at this whole issue. And when he was confronted by religious people in his day, showing him the Mosaic law, and they were thinking about how in their culture they should deal with the issue of marriage and divorce, for example, Jesus said, well, you need to go back previous to the Mosaic law. You need to go back further back to creation and see how God designed marriage. And what he says is, and he's quoting Genesis 2, that a man shall leave his father and mother, leave his parents, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So he says God created them male and female, man and woman, and the two come together in marriage, become one flesh. And then he says, what God has put together, let no one separate. So it's two people, a man and a woman, married for life. That was God's perfect design. Now, in saying that this was at the creation that God designed it this way, he's saying this is how God intended it to be. This is what marriage is supposed to be. So what Jesus is saying is that the Jews in their own way were corrupting marriage, but clearly, by implication, the Gentiles had corrupted marriage in many ways, and all cultures have a tendency to corrupt marriage. But God's design for marriage, his ideal for marriage that is universal from creation, is a man and a woman becoming one flesh and being together for as long as they both live. So that's Jesus' view on marriage. That's the Christian view. It's a universal view of marriage. It doesn't just apply. It's just not one view among many views. It is the universal perspective of marriage according to Jesus. And so I think we need to argue for it that way. We need to argue for marriage as a universal moral principle. And I think it is possible to do this. One really encouraging issue that we can see how this has made gains in our society is actually the issue of abortion. A lot of people have tried to say, well, abortion is just a religious issue. And maybe at first Christians did tend to put it in those terms, but I think more and more we have shown as Christians that abortion is really a universal moral issue. It applies to all people because we're talking about the life of this child. And that's something that, universally speaking, if you take away the life of that child, that's something that's very, very, very serious. And so we have, over time, I think, really made the case. And you can see our culture now, even though our culture isn't really Christian by and large, not in function, it's not Christian. There are even many non-Christians now that are saying, yeah, I am pro-life. And that's because Christians have put forth a universal moral principle and applied it to abortion. And I think we need to do the same thing with marriage. And I'm saying that on the grounds of how Jesus depicted marriage. Jesus showed that marriage is a universal thing. I think, unfortunately, what David French is doing, whether he means to or not, is he's positing Christianity and its views as just one of various voices on the issue of marriage. But I think when he does this, he's really conceding to atheistic secularist thought, which would say that society that is secular gets to determine what is ultimately true, and Christianity can just be kind of a dissenting voice. And I believe that Christianity, at its heart, is rooted in universal moral principles, as I've been talking about in this video. And a good example is even how our country was founded. That when the founders made justification for our country, they said, we have been endowed by our Creator. They are positing something universal, that we've all been endowed by our Creator. We're all created beings and been given universal rights. And it's these rights that allow us to form the country that we have. So they were taking something from Christianity and applying it in a universal sense. Our country was founded on these kinds of ideas. And so I think the same with marriage. It's not just religious to say that marriage is between a man and a woman for life. It's something that Jesus actually shows us as a universal moral principle rooted in creation. And therefore, marriage should have one universal definition and application in our society. And not only is this more biblical and more consistent with what Jesus says, but I think on a practical level, it'll actually create greater peace in the long run. Now, there is going to be the question of, well, wait a second, we already have a different definition of marriage and a different function of marriage. What do we do now? And I think the answer is going to be really difficult, but we need to find a way to have a cohesive understanding and definition of marriage. And yes, that would mean some changes that would be very, very hard at this point, but I think it's really the best way forward ultimately. So those are my thoughts. That's my pushback, my counter view to what David French in that view says. I think there can only be one definition of marriage. I'd like to know what you think about all this in the comment section below. But thank you so much for taking some time to listen to some of my thoughts on this from a Frisch Perspective.